So I want to begin with a common anecdote that you hear from like NASA people and journalists talking about the space program, historians. The anecdote goes like this. President Kennedy was visiting a NASA facility during the Apollo program, and they're showing him around. He's there very late, and he finds a janitor. And he's surprised that this janitor is working so late. And so he says, Mr. Janitor, what are you doing? And the janitor replies, Mr. President, I'm putting a man on the moon. And this is supposed to be kind of surprising, right, that a janitor would think this. And this anecdote is supposed to, of course, it says something about the sort of unity of the American people and the unity of workers, particularly, that who even may have been very abstractly related to spaceflight, still felt like that they were contributing to this, right? Still felt like they were building this future. So probably this anecdote is not true. Probably President Kennedy did not talk to this janitor, but it seems like something that could be true, right? And that's why people bring it up a lot. So in fact, there's probably not much historical evidence to suggest that this was particularly true, that this janitor might have said this. What I'm going to talk about today is the extreme labor unrest that happened during the Apollo program, which is one of the most serious problems that NASA faced. There were hundreds of strikes in the space industry from around the time of Sputnik 1 to the end of the Apollo program in 1972. So if you know anything about American labor history, this is actually really surprising given the time period. In the late 50s and early 60s was a time of very labor passivity in the US. There wasn't very many strikes at all, where these were really, really intense, large-scale strikes all over the country. They were also concentrated in the Deep South, which is also very surprising. There was not that much. These were highly skilled industrial union workers, which there weren't very much of in the South, we tend to think. And the ones that were there, we tend to not think of being this like strike prone or this militant. So this regional story is also very surprising. And then, of course, this is also happening in the midst of the space race, the Apollo program, the arms race, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's all these same workers working on this. It doesn't match our historical perceptions of the Cold War. So the story today is how union workers experienced the space age in the US and why these strikes happened. And it's a story about how the space age was not just a series of engineering feats in space, of course, but an attempt to bring about a deeply transformative industrial revolution on the ground. That would change the politics, economy, and society of the United States and eventually the planet. Workers had to be brought into that space age. Labor relations had to adjust to the more dire and more complex state priorities of long-term technological development necessitated by the Cold War and made most dramatic in spaceflight. Labor was one of the first social inhibitors that had to be reshaped in order for the space age to thrive. And the precise issue that it really came down to was whether workers believed in the space age, whether they believed in that future, whether that janitor would have really said, I'm putting a man on the moon. But to give away the ending, this is a story of failure, of a social revolution that was transformative but did not succeed, just as the space age, as NASA originally imagined it, also failed. So what was the space age and what do I mean by it failed? Probably for an audience of space experts like you, this is a relatively familiar story. But it's just to say that the historical trajectory of NASA since the Apollo program is entirely different from what NASA imagined it would be doing. NASA imagined basically an infinite acceleration of funding and an infinite acceleration of ambition. Early projections were for Mars programs and space stations and lunar colonies and whatnot, all between like the 1970s and the 1990s. Just to give you a sense, this is a graph of predicted funding made in 1972. The little checkered line is the funding for the Apollo program. That is actually, like, relatively speaking, accurate. The black line above that was the funding that they thought they would get for a Mars program, a manned Mars program at the same time, not even including the rocket or the nuclear engine as cost, which would, of course, been the largest cost. So this is an astronomical amount of money that they expected to have. And they expected to be relatively uncontroversial. It was normal for agency leaders in the 1950s and early 60s to say by the year 2000, human would have already reached the edges of the solar system and all the infrastructure necessary for interplanetary society would be there. This was the space age as was originally imagined, and this is what failed. While technologically, this long-term future was, of course, still quite distant in the Apollo program, industrially and politically, NASA was setting about trying to create it, to lay the groundwork for it. This new civilian and military space industry emerging, overseen by NASA and the military, was, according to its architects, the largest construction job ever undertaken in the United States and a labor project unparalleled in the history of the world. This sudden massive growth reflected the sudden massive significance of space technologies. This was the space race and the arms race. All federal policy in the late 50s and early 60s had become secondary to the production of these machines, whether they were NASA spacecraft or military ICBMs. It's kind of impossible to know how many workers were involved, but both NASA and the DoD estimate that in their space programs, there was about 400,000 people working directly or indirectly each. There's quite a bit of overlap, but we can estimate, at the most 800,000 people. Why do I mention the military space program here too? Well, that's because, of course, civilian space and military space are very different, right? They do different things, but industrially speaking, they are part of the same project. They use the same sites, the same companies, the same workers, and they had the same labor problems. And as workers saw it, there was only one industry, and that was the rocket industry. So as the size, significance, and complexity of the rocket industry grew, so did strikes across the entire industry. By 1961, there had already been 356 strikes since Sputnik in the space industry, causing delays 10 times worse than in the average American industry. And who were these workers and why were they striking? Well, it's important to note that these were not like NASA workers or military employees, soldiers, or anything like that. These were union workers working for private companies that were publicly contracted with NASA and the DoD. That can kind of sound weird, but that is the majority, how the majority of government-funded work happens in the United States as public-private contracting. So these were technically private workers, and that meant that they were unionized and they could strike. If they had been public workers, they would not be allowed to strike in the US. And these workers were striking primarily because this new fledgling space industry was so vulnerable to strikes. The rocket industry was geographically very spread out in very poor labor-poor regions, on tight, highly secure sites that made picket lines very effective, with workers doing the most highly complex and delicate industrial work in the country. It provided a unique structure for the space industry that made workers uniquely powerful. And of course, this was a race, right? This was the space race and the arms race. There was a deadline for all of this. They weren't just having to do this incredibly complex work, they were having to do it as fast as possible. And when anything has to be done as fast as possible, then strikes is incredibly powerful, right? It's even more effective. And union workers could also get overtime every time there were strikes or whatever. So there was no reason not to strike. And many workers, when interviewed about why were they striking, seemed uninterested, unimpressed by the future that was supposed to be represented by these rockets, either the future of the space race or the future of the arms race. This was something that they seemed indifferent to. The country was in an existential race with the Soviet Union over the future, but it was workers who were holding the stopwatch. These strikes became first widely known and very scandalous in 1961 when they were discovered by the Senate McClellan Committee. It's not that important to know what that is, but it's the successor to the McCarthy Committee, if people know what that is, a quite influential and conservative organization in the US. The committee denounced these strikes as piratical profiteering by unions who were relentlessly pursuing short-term fictitious rewards at the cost of the long-term collective future of the United States in space. It seemed that workers were uninterested in the national long-term future that was on the line in the rocket industry. McClellan threatened to ban strikes entirely in the rocket industry and possibly in all public-private industry, which doesn't necessarily sound that important, but this would mean effectively banning a huge number of workers from striking and fundamentally changing the labor structure of the United States. The increasingly powerful conservative wing of the government hoped to reform labor relations around the needs of the Cold War by crippling the labor movement. But others in government argued for a more progressive, less compulsory solution. And it was this side that won out for the time being. They had President Kennedy create what was called the Missile Sites Labor Commission, or the MSLC, a tripartite committee of labor, company, and government leaders, which was modeled on the War Labor Board, a similar sort of committee in World War II, which had also tried to prevent strikes in World War II to maintain military production. So rather than banning strikes, members of this committee had to pledge not to strike or to do lockouts. That's just the employer equivalent of a strike. And it said to settle all disputes diplomatically and peacefully through this new sort of informal bargaining table, with government as both a member and an overseer that could peacefully manage these disputes, at least in theory. While this system maybe doesn't sound so radical, right? It's just a committee where people talk about things. It was incredibly controversial. Unions and companies were both historically very resistant to this kind of idea of government intervention. And while the War Labor Board in World War II had been a temporary solution for an emergency crisis of war, which was obviously an emergency, the MSLC was designed to be a permanent solution to the permanent imperatives of the Cold War and technological development in space. It seemed very different. This was a reform that was happening, not just a temporary thing. So while the conservatives wanted to use the space crisis to cripple labor, these progressives hoped to use the crisis to pacify labor, to transition to a post-capitalist, post-class struggle society that would be able to more effectively compete with the Soviet Union, or at least that's how the most extreme reformers thought. In short, both conservative and progressive factions saw this crisis as an opportunity for a serious and permanent reform to American labor relations using the justification of the Cold War. And at the MSLC, the progressives also soon came to a different understanding of how the future really worked for these workers. NASA's newly hired labor relations chief in 1961, Paul Stiles, argued that the problem wasn't that workers were choosing to reject this long-term future of the nation in space, it's that they inherently could not understand it. That was not how workers functioned. They didn't have that kind of relationship with the future. As he saw it, workers were incapable of doing anything but seeking a short-term material future in the form of better wages, better homes, and better benefits. And there was no point in trying to convince them of anything else. As he put it, workers just wanted more. And that was an inherent part of being a worker. Stiles' solution, which he soon gathered his progressive allies around, was that in order for the strikes to stop, the government would have to bind its long-term technological future in space with a short-term horizon of workers, to meld these futures together by providing workers a way to get reliable material gains from the growth of the industry, not through strikes, but through the government, right? So they weren't going to strike, which is how they normally raise their wages. The government has to grant them higher wages and other benefits. And it was true that workers did see the future very differently than companies or the government, right? Is technological progress necessarily a good thing for workers? No, of course not, right? Automation can make your job much harder. It can replace your job. Industrial growth wasn't necessarily good. It was a very growing industry, but a very unstable industry, right? 10,000 aerospace workers might lose their jobs in California and 20,000 might get their jobs in Texas the next day, which is nationally good, right? For GNP, this looks good, but it doesn't do anything to help California workers. And these aerospace companies were also trying to de-unionize. They were moving into the Deep South, which was a very anti-union place with much more anti-union laws, in order to cripple these unions. And these workers were quite aware of this. So together, all of these concerns amounted to a future of anxiety, not a future of progress for workers. And that informed the relationship with the space industry and explained partly why they were so intent on striking and uninterested necessarily in this future that it was selling, right? It was not necessarily a future that was positive for them. As a former union organizer himself, it was this sort of working class relationship to the future that Stiles felt that he understood and sympathized with. And so he set out to bargain over this long-term future and this short-term future. What did that look like? Well, we don't need to get into all the technical details here, but there were two basic components. One was allying with more conservative, what were called business unions, like the International Association of Machinists, the IAM, who also, like Stiles, believed that strikes were this like outdated, ineffective form of getting material betterment, and it was better to have gentlemanly agreements, right? Sort of informal mediation that was a more reliable and diplomatic way of getting gains. And so Stiles and his comrades in the government deliberately allied with the IAM and gave them basically preferential treatment, allowing them to soak up 80% of the entire space industry, the workers in the entire space industry, very, very quickly. So it became the dominant union, and they were able to push out more rebellious ones. And Stiles also formed project stabilization agreements. This is sort of complex, but it's sort of a master agreement that would happen in every site that would supersede all other forms of contracts on the site. And it would basically be the way that the government would guarantee increased wages, increased benefits, all of these things that workers would normally get through strikes, through these sort of master agreements that required the consent of companies. But notably, these agreements relied on people like this, close circles of professional negotiators for all sides, people like Stiles, who often worked very quickly without any kind of like democratic sanction. And it wasn't a system that workers could really contribute to or have much say in. And it was also important that NASA didn't really have any formal powers as a government body to do any of this kind of stuff. The only power that it really had, the only enforcement mechanism was the future, right? So if companies or unions were misbehaving, if they were causing strikes, it would say, well, we're not going to give you contracts for these nuclear rockets. We're not going to let you move into our facility in Louisiana where we're going to be building this Mars program, stuff like this, right? They use the future as a cudgel to get what it wants. And at first, this is really successful. The strikes basically entirely evaporate. Something like 99% of the work gets worked in immediately after the founding of the MSLC. This labor peace lasts a couple of years into 1963, which doesn't sound that long, but this is the most critical period where they're building the entire Apollo program, also rolling out most of the ICBM program. So it's a huge success in that way. And during this time, the IAM, this successful conservative union, also came to embrace the space age. It changed its name to the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers. It became one of the fiercest advocates for civilian and military space. And it came to celebrate space widely as a new identity for the union, as you can see here. The first astronaut in space was an honorary member of the union, as were many other astronauts. And the union was claiming through these acts, like JFK's mythical janitor, that it was the ones putting men on the moon. It seemed as if union workers had, come around to this idea of the future, the sense of, quote, overriding responsibility to the national interests. And it seemed that this experimental labor system was suitable grounds for a new space-age capitalism that would be able to leave the class struggle behind. But it was a bargain that wouldn't last. In 1964, strikes started to creep back into the industry, and by 1965 is a full strike wave that was threatening to cripple the Apollo program. These strikes were fewer in number, but much larger and more devastating, in part because of these centralizing effects of these government mechanisms. And once the most cooperative union, the Machinists were now the most rebellious union, as it entered a series of massive strikes that crippled the industry and its largest contractors. So why was this happening? Why did the bargain fall apart? Well, many companies refused to abide by these agreements and that they had entered and refused to recognize unions, even when the president tried to force them to. Second, Stiles lost control of NASA labor policy. This was still a very controversial position to be pro-union like this in the government, to encourage unionization, even if it was discouraging strikes. And NASA, after a while, went back to sort of more punitive management-like methods. And workers also struck not against their employers, but against NASA directly, increasingly seeing it as the real boss, as the real enemy that needed to be confronted. And there was a growing disagreement between union workers and union leadership. Workers felt that they were not really truly represented by these gentlemanly agreements made by besuited men smoking cigars and martinis in backfilled rooms. They wanted democratic sanction over these agreements. And so they went on strike constantly without much sanction from their leadership. And the government mechanism, the MLC, these agreements, never really formalized into a serious body, a proper kind of labor bureau as it was idealized. But most seriously, the promise of the space age as a future declined. Despite NASA's promises of infinite growth, the federal government started to cut deeper and deeper into the agency's budget beginning in 1965 and dismissed any notions of an equally expensive project for the 1970s like the Apollo program. And it had been that future of growth that NASA had used to ensure companies and workers' cooperation. And without it, it had no power. By 1967, the MLC fell apart, and most of the agreements made within it would fall apart within the following years. In 1969, when Buzz Aldrin, another member of the union, walked on the moon, thousands of his union brothers and sisters in the IM and other unions were walking the picket line on Earth. As that promise of infinite growth failed and faded more and more in the years to come, both NASA and the IAM came to see the moon landing not as the great first steps into the space age, but as the end of the space age, which was followed by a period of seemingly infinite stagnation. NASA and the IAM's futures had come entwined, and they had collapsed together. Almost done, sorry. So where does this leave us today? Well, I don't know how much the news has made it to France, but there was quite controversial, quite big machinist strikes at McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. These are the two of the largest aerospace contractors, where IM machinists branded signs reading things like "Our future, our fight," and overwhelmingly rejected deals that had been agreed to by more conservative union leadership, just as they had in the 1960s. I think this demonstrates that this aerospace labor problem isn't going away, even if it had seemed to for a few decades. The union movement now is much weaker than it was in the 1960s. Aerospace, I think, remains an industry uniquely vulnerable to labor power, and I would say unavoidably so. Now, I'd guess that while a limited space program, like the one, say, SpaceX is building or NASA is building, is possible in the labor relations of the United States today, a sort of truly ambitious interplanetary colonization program like Musk is calling for and other space advocates I think is impossible without confronting this labor conundrum. Whether it's a federal program or a corporate program, you're going to meet this barrier of how do you deal with your workforce. And what NASA encountered in the Apollo program was a staunch opposition of working class people who would reject any long-term national future that they did not see as aligning with their interests. But they did try to make these long-term futures align with their interests. And I think this history also demonstrates how people try to reconcile these futures, right? The horizons of technology and everyday people can meld, but it requires reliable and strong government mechanisms, agreements democratically sensitive to the people they include, and a willingness to enforce these agreements, not just on workers, but on private industry, which is far more wealthy and powerful, of course, and which has its own prerogatives for the future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Renny, for this fascinating speech. You know, it was a very, very difficult time for all of us because we just come back from lunch. So it was
sorry.
Still, it was fascinating. And I have one question. You told at the beginning that space was concentrated in the deep south, which was a bit surprising. But if we look at the other countries, for instance, Great Britain, it's in Scotland, French, it's in Guyana. So it's very, very common that space activities are concentrated in uncommon places where there has not been so much development. So do you think that it changes these territories, that it brings big changes in these territories like Scotland or Guyana or Deep South in USA? And do you think that all these people who are coming to Deep South and who are coming from New York, Washington, Chicago, or very different places, they are themselves very changed? Do you see my question? Because it's a question that I'm asking myself about French Guiana. How is it that so many people coming from Paris or from Toulouse or from Lyon are coming in deep Guyana where there is almost nothing? And what about the same question in USA? So thank you.
This is a great and really, really important question. I would say that there's important changes in various ways. One is how, the industrial development of this region, how the region changes. One is how workers change in these places, and not just industrial workers, but all these different sorts of people that come. And then how does the space program change, and how does space change by being in part of these places? I think obviously Cape Canaveral, these launch sites, it's helpful to be closer to the equator, right? But you don't necessarily need to build, the place where you build your rockets near it. It's just helpful. These places were picked because they're near rivers. There was various geographic reasons, but mostly because this region was very poor and needed industry. At least that was the idea. And so NASA was sold to the South as an industrial program, that it would launch the South from the age of cotton to the age of space, right? That you would skip over sort of the messy industrialization in between. Of course, that didn't happen, or at least it only partially happened, right? The space program didn't form this infinite economy as they imagined it. Ended up being a much smaller thing. I mean, still significant in the parts where it is, but not that. And so there was an extreme sense of betrayal by a lot of the kind of politicians who had helped argue for this. Of course, it also changed NASA by being in the deep Jim Crow South. This was the most conservative political regime in the country, and the politicians that it had, in Congress, the ones supporting it, were all of the most reactionary, segregationist, hyper-conservative Democratic congressmen who would, fight for segregation one day and NASA the next. And I think that changed the agency. It'd be interesting, if it was in Seattle or Boston or something like this, how would it have looked different? I think it might have socially looked very different. It's possible. I think it's not, there's also, quite a lot of Germans who were brought over into the program. And I think that there was some debate about, well, where should we put them? I haven't seen anything like, why did they decide Alabama to, put the Germans? But I think it was also, these people are, many of them are former Nazis. You want to put them in a place where it's not going to be controversial. Where do you put them? In the Deep South, in northern Alabama, the most conservative part of the country. Yeah, so I think that there were these decisions. And with the workers, it was very transformative. So there was mostly industrial, highly unionized militant industrial workers, probably from the Midwest and California, coming down to the Deep South. So they brought the unions with them. And they brought these sort of militant strike traditions with them. They weren't necessarily kind of like leftists. These were more sort of conservative, radical types. It's kind of hard to guess what their politics were. But they were people who were not, there was segregation all over the country, but of course it was most serious in the South. And so they came as somewhat desegregated unions into an industry that wasn't segregated. So the machinists have been sort of the poster child of a segregated white supremacist union before this. That starts to kind of change slowly over the time. But even there, they're going into the South, and despite being, a sort of famously racist union, they're holding the first mixed meetings in all of these towns because they have an integrated workforce. It's not a very integrated workforce, but it's significant, right? And it changes things that all of these workers are coming from outside of the South with their own political traditions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.